I do think Churchill, from Richard and John through to Edward III, I would say, is probably the best bit for me of the history of the English-speaking peoples. So I shall continue quoting from Churchill for the next couple anyway. Here's a general quote. He said, "It was a reign of turmoil and distress, and yet the forces of progress moved doggedly forward. Red-hot iron was smitten on the anvil," this is a metaphor, "red-hot iron was smitten on the anvil, and the hammer blows forged a metal more tense than had yet been seen. In this period, the common people, with their Anglo-Saxon tradition of ancient rights and law running back to remote antiquity, lay suffering under the armoured feet of the nobility and of the royal mercenaries, reinforced in the main by the power of the church. But the people's masters were disunited. Not only did their jealousies and ambitions and their taste for war keep them at variance, but several rending fissures were opening among them. They were divided into parties. They were cross-cut obliquely by a strong nationalism. It is an age of impulse and experiment, not controlled by any general political theory." So I think that one of the takeaway things is that there's a couple of big revolts happen during Henry's reign.
Oh, was this the Peasants' Revolt?
That's later.
Yeah.
Of course, he starts his reign in the middle of John's sort of civil war. Then there's a much bigger baronial revolt in the sort of middle or towards the end of his reign, and that's the one with Simon de Montfort.
Right.
So the story of Henry III, the takeaway thing is that it's wrapped up in the story of Simon de Montfort and the second Baron's revolt. So they're the main things, but lots of other themes are worthy of note. His sort of relationship with the church, the laws, all sorts of things. But we'll get into it. So if we pick up from when John died.
Yep.
Churchill said, "King John died in his toils, but he died at bay." In other words, he was still in the Civil War, but not being chased or anything.
I mean, he was winning the Civil War.
Right, he looked like he was starting to win, yeah. Although Louis the Lion was holding London, so it was far
wasn't
from
over, but he was getting the upper hand.
So you can imagine, can't you, that the party around the boy Henry III, led at least in part by William the Marshal, you can imagine when John dies, they're like, oh, that's inconvenient, to say the least, right? We're in the middle of something here.
Yeah.
The chips have been thrown high.
Yeah.
Nothing is inevitable here. We know there is the continuation of the Plantagenet line, but nothing like that could be taken for granted. Churchill said, "The misgovernment of his reign, John's reign, had brought against him what seemed to be an overwhelming combination. He was at war with the English barons, who had forced him to grant the charter. They had invited Louis, son of the implacable Philip, King of France, into the country to be their liege lord, and with him came foreign troops and hardy adventurers. The insurgent barons north of the Humber had the support of Alexander, King of the Scots. In the west, the rebellion was sustained by Llewellyn, the powerful Prince of North Wales. The towns were mainly against the king. London was vehemently hostile. The Kinkports were in enemy hands. Winchester, Worcester and Carlisle, separated by the great distances of those times, were united in opposition to the crown." So although John had been going around being successful in various sieges and sort of putting down whoever he sort of came across, in general, he was still sort of up against it, if you like. Churchill says, "On the other hand, the recreant king had sacrificed the status of the realm to purchase the unswerving aid of the papacy. A strong body of mercenaries, the only regular troops in the kingdom, were in John's pay. Some of the greatest warrior nobles, the venerable William the Marshal and the famous romantic Ranulph, Earl of Chester, with a strong following of the aristocracy, adhered to his cause." So even though a lot of the country's against him, he's got a few powerful, strong people on his side.
Well, he's got the only professional body of troops, which counts for a lot.
Yeah. Even Louis's army are sort of more mercenaries than they are, sort of regular troops. The mass of the people, bewildered by this new quarrel of their masters, on the whole inclined to the king against the barons, and certainly against the invading foreigners. Their part was only to suffer at the hands of both sides. Thus the forces were evenly balanced. Everything threatened a long, stubborn civil war and a return to the anarchy of Stephen and Maud. John himself, after a lifetime of subtleties and double-dealing, of illegal devices and sharp unexpected twists of religious policy, showed himself possessed in the last months of his life of a warlike energy and resource which astonished friend and foe. It was at this moment that he died of dysentery, aggravated by fatigue and too much food and drink. So that's where the story of Henry III kicks off. Now, I always feel sorry for these boy kings.
Can't be easy.
Right. Because apart from anything else, it's like perhaps being an heir or an heiress as a child today. Now imagine being a small child and your parents die and you're left hundreds of millions or something, or a billion. And you're going to grow up with a warped view. You're not going to be a well-balanced person, almost certainly, are you?
Yep.
It'd be very difficult, if not impossible, to sort of be normal. Imagine being 9 years old and being told you're king, and there's this whole party of barons, of warriors, and you're like dealing with the Pope and stuff.
I can't really.
Right, yeah,
I can't even
imagine
imagine how
it.
difficult that is. I mean, I don't know what the perspective of a 9-year-old like that is. 'Cause, I mean, my son's nearly 9, and I would wish something like that upon him.
Yeah, even if you have a sort of a small amount of wealth or power, it's the classic trope, isn't it, that child actors grow up to be all kinds of messed up.
Yeah.
And that's just that's like you've been on TV a bit.
I think that
And
might
it
be the
screws with you.
consequence of Hollywood, though.
Yeah, maybe.
Being
Yeah,
Hollywood.
probably, yeah. Well, there's that as well.
As much as it is like the fame, and don't get me wrong, I'm sure that doesn't help. But yeah, I think the main issue would be who to trust. Like, you don't know anything. You're very ignorant of the world, and everyone around you is pretending to be your friend.
So, as I said there's basically a massive power struggle, a civil war in all but name, really, or a type of civil war going on, something approaching an anarchy. And there's sort of a royalist party and a rebel party. And so with William the Marshal effectively at the head of the royalist party, they haven't got London. Louis the Lion of France is in London. So they crown him somewhere else. Was it? I don't know if it was Winchester. It says in one of the quotes later. But they get him crowned, and it should really be in Westminster Abbey, because there is a Westminster Abbey, an older version of it before this. Henry III goes on to rebuild it, as I said. But it's the church, the Roman Catholic Church, that stand by Henry III, and he sort of never forgot that. And he sort of, grew up to be very, very pious and, completely Catholic. We're still long before the Reformation, aren't we? We're long before even Wycliffe. It's either Rome or nothing, sort of thing. And he, sometimes in people's minds, religion just clicks, and it becomes a massive part of their whole personality, their whole worldview. Because, of course, his father, John, was fairly irreligious, or seemed to use...
Hardly a good Christian.
He seemed to use religion as just one more tool in his toolbox of politics, rather than genuinely caring about his soul and things. So,
well, what I find with these sorts of people, and I think this is kind of reflected in Alfred the Great as well, when there are tremendous upheavals and huge amounts of political turmoil, and you are looking for something that you can claim is a singular, unvarnished good. There's no question as to whether I should do what is written in the Bible and follow Jesus' word and things like this. And this, I think, acts as a kind of point on a compass for these people through these difficult times.
For sure. There's solace in that, isn't there? That you've got confirmation from sort of the rest of the world, from most of society, saying this is morally correct.
Yeah. Well, that's the point, isn't it? It's not just solace. It's moral clarity.
Right.
Because a lot of the time you can have lots of different people around you with lots of different competing moral claims, and you don't know. You know, and there's chaos everywhere. There's a perennial lack of information about almost everything that happens as well. Like we're very spoiled in the modern era with the amount of information we can get very, very quickly. A lot. One of the things that people don't realize about, and it literally going back to like before the radio, so you know up until like the Victorian era, is there was just ignorance, and they knew they didn't know what was happening in India until 3 months later a letter arrived. Tell them, you know, and things like this, you know, that sort of thing. And this is just a perennial problem in history, is intelligence. And so if you've got chaos going on, it becomes, and you've got all these different claims being made against you. It's just easy to say, well, look, I'm going to follow what Jesus said because that is obviously the correct thing and everyone agrees. There's no one who's going to say, well, no, that's not right. You know, and so I think it's a kind of security.
Certainly in the first half of the 13th century, there's no one saying, actually, the Pope is completely wrong.
There's no Richard Dawkins at this time.
Yeah. Or actually, maybe we could say this now. I was going to leave it for a bit later, but let's quickly discuss it now.
Yeah.
The Albigenses.
We can.
So I mentioned this before even Wycliffe, who was a very, very early precursor to the Protestants.
Yeah.
One of the first people to say, there's nothing in the Bible here about popes and saints and revering Mary, and nothing in the Bible about relics, for example.
Nothing in the Bible about a Pontifex Maximus,
a
pagan high priest of Rome.
Or that you can literally pay money to have people pray on your behalf and things like this.
Yeah. Intercession with saints? What are you talking about? None of this makes any sense.
A lot of the stuff that Martin Luther and the Protestants in the 16th century had a problem with, people were still a couple of hundred years earlier making the point.
Yeah, it's not a new point. It's just Martin Luther writes down the 95 Theses and nails it to the door and says, look, this is BS. And if you are a biblical literalist and a strictly scripturalist, then yeah, you can't really argue the point, actually. These are all traditions that grew up out of the Roman pagan religion when it Christianized.
Yeah, there's all sorts of inconsistencies between the Gospels, and the Old Testament, and the way the Catholic Church conducted itself in the Middle Ages. And
also the general thesis of Jesus. Very briefly on the Albigensian Crusade and the Cathars. The Cathars had a very strong argument because they called themselves the good Christians, and they would walk barefoot around the land in black robes, and they would set up little shops in various towns where a few of them would just spin wool or do whatever it was to make a living, and they would live as Jesus lived, as in poor, among the poor, helping the poor. They would take vows of celibacy when they reached sort of middle age, and they would do good works in exactly the way they believed Jesus was represented to do in the Bible. This is very persuasive when the other side of the argument is a massive gilded papal retinue of a cardinal or something like that, who's on horseback, who has giant landed estates, who himself has thousands of pounds of gold and dozens of armed men. And you say, well, you're not really the Christian here, are you? Because if Jesus came back, who is he going to approve of? And of course, the argument was with the Cathars and not the Pope. And just to cut it all very short, the Pope couldn't win the argument, and so he killed them all.
And not just the Pope, your local bishop.
Yeah, sorry.
Your local abbot. Yeah. It's like...
Yeah. Sorry, the Catholic Church entirely couldn't win the argument. And so they called a crusade, and so crusaders would march around Languedoc, besieging castles and massacring heretics.
So they would say things like, well, in the Bible, Jesus seems to be extremely interested in sort of helping the poor and being fair. And there's nothing really about hoarding wealth.
In fact,
and
Jesus
things.
has several dictums against hoarding wealth,
Yeah.
actually.
Or
Give away all
building-
your wealth and follow me if you want to enter the kingdom of God. It's more difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God than a camel to go through the eye of the needle. Things like this. It's obvious that Jesus isn't pro-luxury.
There's nothing here in the Bible about sort of an ecclesiastical tax collecting structure, and we're going to build giant cathedrals and abbeys and monasteries, and there's nothing about that. So so why am I sort of compelled to give the church money all the time and things?
Yeah.
Why are they collecting? So okay, so
And just as a quick thing as well, there's strong anti-clerical movements all over Europe at this time, because the church has very clearly become a temporal power rather than a spiritual power. I mean, much of the legends of Robin Hood, people think, oh, Robin Hood must have been against the king. No, Robin Hood was a staunch royalist. Robin Hood was against the church. Robin Hood went around robbing monks all the time because the monks would have massive sacks of gold because the monks had been extorting people on religious grounds for their money. And that's just, you know, the reflection of it in England. That's the way that the English peasantry remembered it. You know, the Cathars are the sort of, the Occident version of that. And you've got various other, you know, in Germany and everywhere else, you've got various other anti-clerical movements because the church has become a physical power in the real world that is exercising direct political power under people like Innocent III, who calls the Albigensian Crusade. And so you can see why people would say, well, this isn't really very Christian.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.